Well, John T. Edge, welcome to Biscuits and Jam.
Glad to be back. Thank you, Sid.
So, John T., I wanted to start at the top, asking you about Birmingham, because I know that this is a place that you have a lot of connections to. You've been coming here for a long time. You've written about this city. It's a really meaningful place for you. But just tell me a little bit about your relationship with Birmingham.
It's deep. I moved here not long after I flunked out of college in my first college run. I moved here soon after I got a corporate job. I was a salesman. I sold a data stream of financial analysis to fixed income traders and foreign exchange guys, a far cry from what I do now, and lived in the South Side. And that's the first time I went to Highlands Bar and Grill. This would have been 1987, probably 86. And, that was the beginning of my love affair with the city, was that restaurant. I also went to someplace that was it was a chili house, and they also had scuba diving equipment. Somebody in the audience is going to know who that is. Somebody in your audience for Biscuits and Jam is going to know it. Okay, see, I told you. Here we go. This has always been this beautiful, mysterious town to me. So I got to know this town better through the Southern Foodways on us, through my work there. The founding meeting for that organization was held in this very building where we are today at Southern Progress, Southern Living. And then as my wife and I courted and married, this was the town to which we would escape. We'd come to eat at Chez Fonfon and Highlands Bar and Grill and Bottega. And more recently, we come to drink at House of Found Objects and have lunch at Johnny's, which is what I did today for Greek and 3 food. I think they can stand up to anyone. So this is a place we return for joy, for great food, for great drink, for friends.
Well, I hope you keep coming back as often as possible. It's always great to have you in town. I want to get right into your book because there's a lot to talk about. And it's called House of Smoke, Searching for Home. As someone who's known you for a long time, I think I've known you for probably 20 years, and I thought I had an idea of what this book was going to be about, and I was wrong. There was so much more to your story. I thought this might be a book that really kind of centered on your food journey. You had another fantastic book that came out called The Pot Liquor Papers, which was, much more of an academic book in a lot of ways, and kind of looking at Southern food culture. But this one is a very personal story. I wanted to just have you read the prologue, which is very short, and I think that y'all will get a very quick idea of why I was surprised as I got into this book and why it was kind of startling.
I mean, this prologue is an answer to people. So you wrote another book about food. Food is in this book. It's throughout this book, but it is not the focus of this book. So I'll read this by way of explanation and introduction. The prologue is called Running. I burst out the screen door, bare feet on gravel. 20 feet ahead, my mother runs toward the dark woods, her red house dress trailing like a cape. She couldn't take another minute inside our house. She couldn't take another minute inside her head. The light from our porch doesn't reach where she's going. At first, I can see the pistol in her hand. But as my mother crosses into the clearing, the red of her dress fades and everything turns black. The crack of that pistol splits open the night. I stumble, catch myself, and plunge forward, past the sand pile where, just a few years before, I plowed toy dump trucks along pretend roads lined with mud skyscrapers. I find her in the rock garden among the pink azaleas beneath a cedar arbor. Mama sits on a bench beside the old jail kitchen that she never quite turned into an antique shop. She cries into her dress. Tears fall down her face. The pistol lies on the ground. Smoke trails from her cigarette. Was that a warning shot? Did my mother push the door open and run toward the woods to fire her pistol into the blue-black sky? Or did she plan to shoot herself? Did she aim above her earrings, change her mind, and crumple to that bench? 5 decades later, I stand at the edge of that memory and peer back in, like I'm watching a scratched print of a black and white film about my childhood. She wanted to make a break. She wanted to make a change. And there was no better way to mark before and after than a run toward the woods and a shot in the night. I ran for a long time too, away from that house, away from my family, away from what my past taught, away from what the South demanded, until finally I turned to face the dark woods.
I just want y'all to sit with that for a second. I mean, that, that's an incredibly powerful way to open a book. And John T., I want you to tell me a little bit about your mother. This book is so much about her. And I'm curious, what was she like kind of in that moment? And why did you want to start the book where you did?
Opposite those words is a picture of my mother in this book, a black and white of my mother holding me on high. I'm maybe 2 months old in one of those dressing gowns that a 2-month-old boy wears in the South. And she's holding me high up against a mirror, and you can see so much pride in her face. My parents didn't think they'd be able to have a child. My father volunteered for Big Brothers, and my mother pined for a child. So when I was born, she was 41. Especially when I was born in 1962, it was a bit of a miracle that I came into this world. And my mother was this woman of great social intelligence. If she was in this room, she's the person y'all would all want to talk to. She was bigger than life. There's a part in the book where I explain, like, my mother took me and my father to go see Elton John on his Goodbye Yellow Brick Road tour. My mother talked us backstage. Just bonkers. My mother from small town Georgia at the Fox Theater in Atlanta, we were backstage with Elton John because my mother talked them into it. On that same trip, she befriended Rosie Greer. Remember Rosie Greer, the football player turned actor? And Joel Gray at another event, like just crazy. And there was such beauty in my mother. And in this book, you will see that. You will come to know her. But there was another side of my mother. And alcohol stole my mother from me and my father. Depression and violence, quite frankly, that defines the first fifth of this book. It gets brighter. The book does. I get brighter. I promise what I've shared with y'all is not the whole of this book, but that tension between my mother's great joy and beauty and then a darker side, I mean, that's the stuff of the South as well. And in many ways, my relationship with my mother is a kind of a mirror of my relationship to the South, too.
Yeah, one of the things that I found so compelling about this story, your story, was that, your mom in a lot of ways was a source of, trauma for you, and you went through a lot with her. But she's also someone that you have a lot in common with.
Yeah.
You love a stage. You love a story. You love a good story. You kind of learn more and more about that throughout the book. And I'm just wondering if you could maybe tell like a funny memory of her or something that, touches on that side of her.
The kind of grandiosity, the in search of a stage mother. When I was a boy, I have 2 friends here from my high school years at Tatnall Square Academy in Macon. I'm going to tell a story from a few years before that when my parents had sent me to a different private school, Stratford Academy in Macon. And my mother, I was maybe, I don't know, fifth grade, sixth grade, something like that, we'd go watch baseball games, and that was at Luther Williams Field, which was their equivalent of Rickwood Field here in Birmingham. A grand old stadium with beautiful bleachers reaching back up from the field. My mother would bring a quilt when we'd go watch the Stratford Eagles play. My mother would always bring a quilt and a picnic basket, and she would have Cokes and the like, and the picnic basket and the quilt she spread on top of the dugout. So you could sit right there in the stadium and watch. It wasn't a full room. You could get really close to the action. My mother wanted to get closer still, so she would lay that quilt on top of the home team dugout. And my mother and I, would climb over the rail while everybody watched. And then we would lay that quilt out, and we would sit there perched on the edge of the dugout, almost on the field. And my mother would say, "Don't look back. Don't give your detractors an audience."
And now you just sit on the dugout every time when you go to a baseball game. Yeah.
Give me the dugout every day.
I want to ask about something else that's a little dark, to say the least, John T. And then I promise we'll move on. But this is really, an important part of your story. And you lived in a house that was broken into over and over again. I mean, it sounds like it was a regular occurrence that you almost came to expect.
From the woods. You remember the prologue I read about the dark woods?
Yeah. You also had someone who died in your house, a very young man, a young boy, who was 12 years old, who shot himself in your house. Just tell me about that moment and, how you processed that. How did you get through that?
Yeah. So Sid's describing a time from when I'm about 8 till I'm about 16 where unreasonable violence defined my childhood in ways that, my friends here who were sitting in the audience who knew me at that age didn't know any of this. I didn't know what to make of this. But, at 8, I discovered the young man. I heard my mother and I were sitting at the kitchen table. We were conjugating verbs. I can remember that. And we had salmon and croquettes for dinner and grits. I can remember that. And I can remember hearing a small pop in the other room. And my mother heard the pop too, but it was an old house. Like, our house was not a fancy one, but it was built in 1821. So it was always some odd sound. Y'all know what old houses are like. They're creaking and cracking. But this sounded different. So went through the hall to my parents' bedroom. When I was researching this book, I went back to my house to kind of retrace the steps to make sure someone else lives there now, obviously, but to retrace the steps to make sure I had it right. So I get to the other side, and there I find this boy not much older than me bleeding to death on my parents' bedroom floor. And then Sid describes the attacks from the woods. I didn't know what all to make of it. I didn't know how to process it. It left me unsteady moving out of those moments because, when violence comes at you, the rational mind wants to understand, so what happened? What did I do to bring this on? I couldn't make sense of it. And in a lot of ways, that's left me unsteady for a long while, not being able to make sense of what was coming at me. And it also left me with a great abhorrence of guns. It left me forever fearful of violence. And it left me, so many people, I'm sure there are a lot of hunters out here, and I don't disrespect hunters' use of guns, but my relationship to the woods is different than many of your relationship to the woods. For many people, the woods are a place of solace and quiet. For me, the woods were a place where violence began because those attacks on our house, people came from the woods, like sneaking up tree to tree. My father one time stayed home to potentially intercept the people who break into our home and found these young men who lived just on the other side of the woods from our house. Like, 200, 300 yards from our house. It changed the way I thought about the woods. It changed the way I thought about myself moving through the world. I couldn't make sense of what was going on. I couldn't make sense of my environment. Can we talk about something less dark?
Yeah, we can. I mean, we can. I mean, the prologue that you read was called Running, but it was about your mother running. It's also about you running, right? And you spent a long time running from a lot of that.
It wasn't until we made a True South show in 2020, and we made it, and we went back to my mother's grave. I was estranged from my mother for a long while. She died 11 days before our son Jess was born. Jess never knew her. In 2020, we made a True South show where we went to my mother's grave in Bowman, South Carolina, the first time I'd ever been there. And in that moment, we were making that show, we were writing that show, this line emerges, and it is, for the longest time, I thought when I was traveling the road, going to eat at this barbecue joint or that hot dog joint, I always thought that I was running toward whatever that new discovery was, whatever the future held, the next person to meet. And I realized in that moment in 20, we were making that show when I'd finally gone to my mother's grave, that I could quit running, because that was running away. It wasn't running towards something. I was running away from my past. Some of what I said in the prologue, running away from the South, running away from my family. And I realized that I could quit running away, that I was home. I was home with Blair.
Yeah, you mentioned South Carolina and Bowman, and I've got to tell a funny story. So the last time that we did a podcast together, I was asking John T. about his family history. And his mother's maiden name is Evans. And your son's name is Jess Evans Edge.
Jesse Clifton Evans Edge. A lot of words.
So we started talking about family history, and he said, that's where my family dates to. And I said, that's funny, because my family actually dates to Orangeburg, South Carolina, too. It didn't take us very long to figure out that we're actually cousins.
Yeah. I mean, the same Revolutionary War, like we got people who fought in the Revolutionary War in our family. One who is killed by a Tory at a camp meeting or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, it goes back to a guy named Roland.
Roland and Richard, yeah.
Yes. You do talk about your family history in this as well. What did you kind of think about, as you made some of these discoveries and started to learn more about your past? The
thing I realized is, as a boy, I didn't really know that much about my family history that dated back to the Revolutionary War, because my mother was a house-proud woman who loved the house in which I grew up in Clinton, Georgia. That house had been owned by a U.S. Senator, Alfred Iverson. Alfred Iverson led the secession of Georgia from the Union. His son, Alfred Jr., was born in that house in 1829, took his first breath there. He, as a boy, I understood him to be a hero of the Civil War. When I start researching this book, I realized something I had an inkling of before, but know more fully now, that he led his troops to slaughter at Gettysburg. And so my mother, when I was growing up, kind of adopted that family, the Iversons, as part of our own. And our family was kind of cloaked and kind of obscured from me. I learned more about my family researching this, but my mother claimed the Iversons because they came with this kind of lost cause mythology attached to them.
And you were, even as a young kid, kind of a historian, maybe a misguided historian, but you were standing out in front of your house giving tours, right?
I mean, people would come to see our house. It was an historical marker out front, and I would give people tours. There was a wash pot out front, turned over, and I would climb on top of that wash pot and hold forth. My mother in me then.
So, John T., you have a reputation as an academic. You've spent your life in academia. You have taught. You've written books, but your path was not always so clear when it came to academia. And there's some very funny sections of this book about early days at Georgia. How did you go from Animal House to academia? How did you go from someone who literally did not go to class? And I know this is a long story, but was there a moment, was there kind of a pivotal moment where maybe a light came on and you said, okay, this is not working?
My challenge was I watched a second run playing of Animal House in the summer of 1980 before I went off to college. And I was like, that's what I'm going to do. And I'm not even joking. Like, that was like my instruction reel to watch. And I did it. I had a great time in college. I was lost. But I had to hit bottom. Like, I was in Athens at the University of Georgia, fraternity social chair, booking really great bands like the Flat Duo Jets. I once booked the Flat Duo Jets for $50 and a handle of gin. And yet, here I was flunking out of school, not going to school. So I had to hit bottom and start over. So I made a rash decision and just moved out of the fraternity house, moved to Atlanta, got a job working at Guest Quarters, which was the first suite hotel. There was one up on Perimeter, up north of town. And I got a job there as a waiter and began learning. And within about 6 months, I was managing the restaurant. Within a year, I was out. But I began a corporate career then. I just knew I needed to make a change, and I needed to prove to myself that I was something other than a drunken frat boy.
But really, it was Oxford, Mississippi, and where it seems like you kind of had an epiphany about what you wanted to do and what you wanted to study, and devoting your life really to food and the stories that can be told through food. And I want to ask you about something specific that I think seems like an early light bulb went off for you when it came to hot tamales. So you go to Ole Miss and you're at the Center for Southern Culture, and you figure out that nobody had really told the story behind certain Southern foods, and hot tamales was a great example of that. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So I moved to Oxford to get a undergraduate degree and then a master's degree in Southern Studies, this kind of interdisciplinary study of the South. And there were people there who were studying the front porch as a social space in the South from an architectural perspective. And there were people studying beauty queen culture in the South, and certainly literature and music. And I realized that I could study the food of the South. Barbecue joints of my and the meat and three and the working class cooks of my childhood were worthy of documentation and study in the same way my colleagues were taking on other facets of the South. The thing that fascinated me most was I drove Mississippi. I began to explore. And to the west, in the Delta, not that far away from Oxford, people were selling hot tamales by the side of the road. You'd usually buy 6 or a dozen at a time, and you'd get saltine crackers with it and a little hot sauce. And it made no sense to me. What is this food that we associate with Mexican-American culture? What's it doing in the Mississippi Delta? This place we think of as the most southern place on earth, according to one book. Why is it there? It made no sense to me. And so I started doing research. I ended up going to the Catholic diocese in Jackson looking for records from the old plantation commissaries. And because I had this suspicion that maybe it is because Mexican-American workers came into the Mississippi Delta. And sure enough, in the records of the Catholic diocese, we find that in the early years of the 1900s, Mexican-American workers were brought into the Mississippi Delta to harvest the cotton because African-American workers were leaving the Delta in droves when the getting was good. So as Mexican-Americans brought their labor in, they also brought their foodways in, and tamales are a remnant of that moment.
What did you decide to do when it came to telling that story? I mean, how do you kind of capture that? And bring that to life?
One of the first efforts that the Southern Foodways Alliance undertook was oral history work. So an early colleague, Amy Evans, was our first oral historian, and she began traveling the Mississippi Delta. She also did a lot of work in the low country of South Carolina and in barbecue pits all across the South to interview old guard tamale makers, to ask them to tell the story. From whom did you learn this? Why do you roll tamales? Is this your second job, or is this, do you see this as a business you want to build? Tell us the story of your family and how tamales came to be a part. Because most of the people you find now in the Mississippi Delta making tamales are African American. They're not Mexican American. This food that was once a part of the Mexican American culture has transferred fully into black and white culture in the Delta. So those oral histories painted this kind of portrait of the Delta by way of that one food.
So, John T. mentioned at the beginning that Southern Foodways was founded here. It wasn't actually in this building. It was in the adjacent building where I think they held the first meeting back in
conference room.
in 1999, which was an extraordinary gathering of people. One of the prime movers behind that whole enterprise was a guy named John Edgerton. And John Edgerton, you quoted him in the book. You said that he spoke to, quote, a pervasive spirit of inclusiveness that is deeply rooted in the belief that Southern food is the region's most positive and appealing symbol. So this is an organization that really started out with a really such a meaningful kind of mission statement. And I'm just wondering, what did John mean to you as a mentor?
Yeah. John had two big books, and they imprinted on me in a big way. One was called Speak Now Against the Day, and it was about the generation before the Civil Rights Movement, the kind of wild-eyed dreamers of the past. The second book was Southern Food at Home, on the Road, and in History. And that was a history of Southern food that came out before the book on the Civil Rights Movement. And he taught me that by studying the work of cooks, I might get at the power dynamics in the South. I ended up writing in the pot liquor papers about a woman named Georgia Gilmore who went to that first meeting of the Montgomery Improvement Association in Montgomery as the bus boycott was beginning, and showed up with a hamper of fried chicken with the idea she would sell bone-in chicken sandwiches on white bread to raise money for the bus boycott, because she knew they would need, if they quit the buses and began using church station wagons and the like, they would need gas for those station wagons. They'd eventually need and tires for those station wagons. So she's the literal example of the power resonant in food culture. And I would have never written about her if I hadn't read John and if John hadn't mentored me, both as director of the Southern Foodways Alliance, but also as a writer and friend.
So they elected you as the director of the Southern Foodways Alliance here at that first meeting, right? But John was a mentor for you for a long time after that, even kind of deep into when you were doing lots and lots of programming, correct? When did John die?
Yeah.
John passed away?
He passed away in 2013.
2013. So he must have been there through quite a bit of that early kind of programming. You also said in the book that John was really one of the first people to kind of recognize this connection between food and civil rights. And and I'm wondering if you can talk about that a little bit more, especially being, where we are here in Birmingham.
John was the person who paved the way for us to do an event here in Birmingham in 2004. It marked the 40th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which is, y'all would call, forced the integration of restaurants across America. One of the signal places, one of the suits that was the basis for that was Ollie's Barbecue, which for the longest time was on I-65, just out of downtown. Some people in the audience are nodding, you know it. That case, which I didn't know about until John introduced to me, was one of the things on which we focused when we came here for that event. for that event, we also, by way of introductions that John made, we met with Chris McNair, the father of Denise McNair, one of the little girls killed in the 16th Street church bombing. We had a breakfast of sausage, biscuits, and ambrosia in his office as he showed us a relic from that bombing. He showed us one of his daughter's shoes. It was just a surreal and beautiful moment. And in that same moment, Charles Moore, the great photographer from here in Alabama, who shot many of the kind of iconic photographs, from Life magazine and other sources, he joined that as well. Those were people that were kings to me. I would never have known those people. We would never have been able to program events like that if it hadn't been for John.
So, John C., you left the Southern Foodways Alliance in 2021, and have really been focused on TrueSouth, which is your series on the SEC Network. But you've also been continuing a lot of the same kind of work, talking to as many people as you can, shining a light on places around the South that are not getting covered everywhere else. And a recent episode, you actually took a trip back to Clinton, Georgia, and back to your old house. Talk about that a little bit and what that experience was like for you.
Sure. My work with the SEC Network on TrueSouth is this passport to travel the region. And for the most part, we focus on working class restaurants in various towns across the South. We set them in conversation. We usually focus on 2 restaurants in one place. We set them in conversation with each other to tell some truth about the place. We did an episode last year in Jasper, Alabama, not far from here. One was a working class sushi restaurant, and one was a biscuit restaurant, the South's future and past in one place. But this time, for this episode this year, we went back to Clinton, Georgia. And it functioned in 2 ways. We got to go to the restaurants my father introduced me to. We've talked a lot about my mother here, but my talent as a writer, and really my moral grounding comes from my father, and my love of restaurants comes from my father as well. We went to New Way Wieners, which was, as a boy, I would eat chili dogs there with my father in the afternoon, and before school, we would eat breakfast at New Way. Fresh Air Barbecue was also in that episode. My father was a federal probation and parole officer, which means he was on the road a lot, like I'm on the road now, and he loved barbecue. And barbecue was his reward, his kind of grail for his own road trips throughout Georgia. And we traveled often to Fresh Air in Flovilla, Georgia. Opened since 1929, the kind of mother church of Georgia barbecue. I got to return there to bring our camera crew who were from all across the country and watch them fall in love with that barbecue restaurant, just the same way I did when my father took me there.
And didn't you grow up going to a place called Old Clinton Barbecue?
I did. In Old Clinton, like many restaurants, there's a place called Old Brick Pit in Atlanta, in a similar way, that were inspired by Fresh Air. If Fresh Air is 29, you see other places open in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And even the look of them is comparable. They're low-slung buildings with a big wide porch. Cedar holds up the porch. There's oftentimes wood shavings and sawdust out front. A dogleg flue cooker, so the smoke cools as it goes through that dogleg concrete flue cooker. That's all starts with Fresh Air. And Old Clinton, the joint that was a mile up the road from my house, borrowed from Fresh Air as well.
What was it like for you to go back to that house?
It was surreal to step back into my house. Y'all know this, if you've moved away from the home in which you grew up, when you step back into that, when you cross that transom, you're 8 again, or 10 again, or 12 again, or whatever that age is. That's the way it was for me. The gentleman who owns our house now, I like him a whole lot. His name's Chuck Johnson. And Chuck and I could not be more different. Our political views, our social views, who our heroes are to each other, completely different. He looks at the South and he looks at Clinton and that house kind of in the way I did when I was a boy. but he's been so kind in welcoming me back to his house. He works now as a sutler, which is a term I didn't know until I began researching this book. A sutler is someone who supplies troops as they're on the move. So he supplies Confederate and Yankee reenactors of Civil War battles with uniforms and the like when they're doing reenactments.
Of that trip, you spent how many days there?
Filming, that was a 4-day trip.
So you spent a good amount of time there.
Mm-hmm.
Was there one kind of singular moment that stood out to you? You're kind of facing some old ghosts, and you're looking at those same woods and that same property where all those things happened. Yeah. Was there something that kind of stood out of those 4 days?
Yeah, there's the two moments. One is dark and one's light. The darkness is standing on the patio just outside of our house at about the spot where that wash pot was I told y'all about, that I would stand on to lecture about the Confederate general. Standing there, and then I realized that I was looking straight at my bedroom window. And then when I looked the other way, there were the woods. And I realized that, every day of my childhood, I was always looking at those woods. I didn't even think about that before, those woods from which the threat came. The lightness came when we threw a party for my old Little League friends. I was a fiendish Little League baseball player. I lived for Little League baseball. I was never any good, but if you get me on first base, I could steal home. I'm not joking. I loved baseball. But my friends with whom I'd played Little League baseball came to this little clubhouse just outside of town. And like people I hadn't seen in 45 years since I left Jones County, Georgia at the age of 17, came walking in the door, and we fell back into conversation. We were talking about the carpool lines that we were in. We were talking about their parents and my parents. People were telling me stories about my mother. My mother was perennially our team mother. And people remembered those days. Like in midget league football, my mother convinced Rankin Smith, who at that point owned the Atlanta Falcons, to send us all a signed football for the start of our season. My mother was that person. And my friends remembered her so fondly. They didn't know any of the darkness. They just knew what a great champion of our team and those young men she was. And that was such a gift to me, because in that moment, I got to recognize that the best of my parents, my father's talent for words, my father's morality, my mother's social skills, the best of my parents now lives in me. In a way, by writing this book, I got to jettison some of that worst of me. I got to welcome my mother back into my life, and I got to recognize that the things that I do to serve the larger good are so much grounded in my father's impulses.
So there was a therapeutic aspect to this book. It was therapy for you in a lot of ways.
I would say that writing it in therapy because it's too damn hard to be therapy. But I would say that the end result of this is a balm. I would say that the end result of this is an acceptance and a love of my people and my place.
There's only one recipe in this book. And we actually ran the next of it in the last issue of Southern Living. And it's called Blair's Catfish Stew.
Yeah.
And the real cook in the family is Blair, obviously sitting right over there. She's also a brilliant artist. But this is her catfish stew is a riff on your mother's catfish stew.
Right.
And I'm wondering, of all the recipes in all the world, and all the recipes that have been in your life, why did this feel like the one that you wanted to put in the book, and what does this recipe mean to you?
Yeah, I mean, this recipe was the pathway for me to reconcile with my mother. When Blair and I were young in our marriage, we decided together to cook that recipe as a way for my mother to have some presence in our lives. I'd, for the most part, shut her out of our lives. So that recipe, dinner by dinner over time, brings her back into our lives. My mother's catfish stew was her documentation of her father's catfish stew, which he cooked on the Edisto River in the low country of South Carolina. It's really good. It's there's a little bit of bacon. My mother used streakoline. Blair uses Alan Benton's bacon, advisedly so. There's a little bit of potatoes in it. Blair borrows some from Edna Lewis and Scott Peacock. Their great book, The Gift of Southern Cooking, includes a catfish stew recipe as well. But that recipe is included because that recipe set me on a path to write this book. That recipe was a mechanism for me to bring my mother back into my life. And the end result of this book is a reconciliation with my mother. And there's no better way to memorialize that than by that recipe.
Well, it sure does look good.
It's good.
And I'm wondering, John T., like what do you think about when you make it? What goes through your mind?
I think about how much my mother would have loved to be at our table in Oxford. You know, my mother grew up in the small town South. My mother wanted out of the small town South so bad. She wanted to be like Betty Davis on Broadway. Like my mother wanted to be up and out of the small place that limited her. And now Blair and I live in a different kind of small town South. We live in Oxford, Mississippi. When Blair cooks that stew and friends gather, they're artists and writers and poets. And my mother would have thrived in that world. We oftentimes serve it in these spode china bowls that my mother collected and eventually passed to me that have handles. And my mother loved to tell people that if there are handles in a bowl, you may drink from your bowl. She loved the subversion of that and people looking at her. She also liked to eat asparagus and tell people, now you may pick up your asparagus with your hands if you wish. The other day, there's a passage at the end of the book where someone sent us caviar a couple years back, and I was in search of mother of pearl spoon because I wanted to get it right. My mama taught me right. I was in search of a mother of pearl spoon and couldn't find one. And at the edge of my comprehension, I remembered, oh yeah, like my mother said that blown glass could be an acceptable substitute for mother of pearl. And I had these cocktail stirrers on the bar that were gifted, like many things, from my mother. And I went to the bar to pick up those cocktail stirrers and think, you know, they have a little divot on the end. Maybe those can work. And I realized, oh my gosh, these are not cocktail stirrers. These are my mother's caviar spoons. So she's still with me in so many ways.
Well, I'm going to leave it there. And I just want to say thank you, Book. Thank you to Faisal Valley and House of Found Objects. Thank y'all for coming. And John T. Edge, thanks for being on Biscuits and Jam.
Thank you, Sid.